joining me in the first part of our discussion are Allan Zeman, chairman of the Lan Kwai Fong Group, and Victor Gao Zhikai, chair professor at Soochow University. Well, welcome to the show. Allan, I will start with you. After 156 days of open hearings and an 855-page judgment backed by more than 2,200 pieces of evidence, the Hong Kong court ruled on Jimmy Lai's case through a clearly defined legal process. Yet, Western governments still label it as, quote, political prosecution. Are they disputing the evidence or legal reasoning or rejecting the verdict simply because it doesn't fit the preferred political narrative here?
Yes, correct. Hong Kong.
Yes, Allan, go ahead.
Okay, that is correct. Hong Kong absolutely follows common law system. We have an independent judiciary, and that's always served Hong Kong very, very, very well. We actually had it pre-handover days from the British, and the judges are very, very independent and very, very clear in their judgments. It's an open court. The proceedings were open and transparent, and fair and just procedures. Lai's lawful rights were effectively guaranteed. And both the prosecution and defense had fully presented and cross-examined witnesses in the open. And there's ample evidence that states he colluded with the foreign forces to endanger national security. Lai met with various foreign dignitaries and begged them to sanction Chinese and Hong Kong government officials and tried to overthrow his own government and country. Now, this is not done anywhere in the world. It's not a political prosecution. He broke the law, and we have a trial that lasted almost 156 days that was open for the judges to look at all the evidence, and they came through with a very, very long and lengthy, after all that 855 pages, which at the end Jimmy Lai was judged on, and literally what he did, unfortunately, I feel bad for him, but what he did was absolutely against the law.
Mm-hmm. Victor, politicians in the U.S. and the U.K. in particular have openly demanded Jimmy Lai's release on the case of so-called press freedom, as if a foreign government has the authority to overturn court rulings in Hong Kong. What exactly empowers them to make such demands? Is this really about defending legal principles or about exerting political pressure on China under the banner of values?
First of all, Hong Kong is a special administrative region with its own deeply rooted common law system, and the rule of law tradition has served Hong Kong well. Secondly, in this case involving Jimmy Lai, there was due process, there was a very extended period of hearing, and the judges played their role very dutifully. And eventually, according to the principle of rule of law, there was a conviction of Jimmy Lai. Now, this is the totality of the situation. And Hong Kong generally has been accepted as being part of China. Therefore, no foreign country, whether it is the United States or Great Britain or anyone else, has any legal justification to pointing an accusing finger at this verdict. That's number one. Now, what these foreign countries want to do really constitute direct interference and intervention in the rule of law tradition and exercise and due process in Hong Kong, which is, again, a very heinous act for them to perform. And it reveals their true motivation. That is, they do not like the fact that Hong Kong has been part of China. They still want to do what they thought they could do when Hong Kong was ruled under the British rule. But those years were gone. It will never come back. And whether it is the United States or Great Britain, in this particular case. What they could do, should do, is really to accept the irreversible fact that Hong Kong has become part of China, and it will never accept any foreign interference, be it from the United States or from Great Britain. And we need to respect the due process and the rule of law tradition being practiced in Hong Kong as far as this Jimmy Lai's case is involved. And the verdict being as it has been arrived at should be generally accepted as the final verdict in this particular case.
Yes, Allan, Western critics insist this case is about press freedom or the fight for democracy. But the prosecutors, argue Jimmy Lai used his media platform, the tabloid Apple Daily, to incite unrest and lobby for foreign sanctions activities, far beyond the reporting or commentary as the regular practice in the media. Should media ownership somehow provide immunity from the law?
Unfortunately, I was in Hong Kong during those years, and I can tell you, having lived through it and having my family and my business associates lived through it, it was terrible because Jimmy Lai, who I knew for 45 years when we were in another business before he was in Apple Daily. And in essence, when he started Apple Daily, he always harbored resentment against China, even as a young boy. And unfortunately, he started to poison the minds of young people, of people in Hong Kong, just writing terrible things about China and how bad China is, and not even realizing how much China has changed and really today is one of the best countries in the world, actually. I travel there a lot. And it just pained me to see how young people were led astray, and many were prosecuted for it. And it was not a question of he was really colluding with foreign forces. He then had one of his lieutenants, somebody by the name of Mark Simon, who was his assistant and was American. And unfortunately, he was arranging for Jimmy to go abroad. I remember he met Mike Pence, he met other leaders in the United States, and really calling for China for the United States to really sanction Hong Kong, China in general, and overthrow the government, overthrow what he called the Communist Party. And so, in essence, this in any country would be illegal. Trust me, it was no fun living here at that time. All the streets were blocked. Protesters were out every single night, young protesters. And in fact, many were reporters, and they would come to interview me, and they'd say that, I'm going to quit my job. And I said, why? And they said, well, because I can get 5,000 Hong Kong dollars for standing every night on the front line, 5,000 Hong Kong dollars a night. And I'm only earning in salary $8,000 a month. So it's worth it for me to quit my job. I said, don't be crazy. I said, you've been there for 10 years. And this is the kind of thing. So young people were coerced by payment to go stand on the front lines and protest every night. I mean, I was there sometimes during the protest. Trucks would pull up and they'd unload equipment out into up to the front lines so that they had equipment in order to protest. And it really, really sent a terrible message around the world. It disrupted the life of the people of Hong Kong, who really were not unhappy just because Jimmy wanted, what he called press freedom. And so it was not a question of press freedom or anything like that. You cannot do that anywhere. And it's subversive against the government.
Mm-hmm. Subversive against the government. Victor, it reminds me of Snowden or the others like Assange. The UK, US cared very much about their national security. If there anything against their security, took place, obviously they will take measures against that. but somehow the Chinese national security or security in Hong Kong, somehow that can be, compromised. It's like there's no justification for China to defend its national security. What do you make of that?
Well, let me make several points, which I believe are very, very important in this overall context. First of all, as far as Hong Kong is concerned, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of the people to legally gather and protest and demonstrate have been cornerstone of the democracy tradition in Hong Kong and have served Hong Kong very well over the decades. However, allow me to emphasize, these freedoms, freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of demonstration and protest, have never existed unconditionally, not for Hong Kong or for any other country or region in the world. They always exist in the overall context, and no one should be allowed to abuse these freedoms, important as they are, for their illegal purposes. Now, in the case of Jimmy Lai and the Apple Daily, they tell you that they are exercising freedom of express, freedom of press. The reality is that they are really committing subversion of the government. They are really inciting for the overthrow of a legal government in Hong Kong, and also calling for the so-called independence of Hong Kong, calling for the overthrow of the Communist Party of China, which is the ruling party in China. So all these things are not legitimate exercise of freedom of press. They are, in substance, as ruled by the court in Hong Kong, as subversion, as violence, for example. And the way they incite violence, they incite not protest, they incite rioting and anarchy and chaos in Hong Kong, which become so much of a prey on the peace and stability and the ordinary life of the people in Hong Kong for those long months. This is the crux of the case involving Jimmy Lai. It's not about freedom of press. It's not about freedom of expression, freedom of gatherings, for example, of the people, or freedom of protests and demonstrations. It is about whether Jimmy Lai and his associates and the newspapers or the platforms he owned and operated were really inciting violence and calling for subversion and overthrowing the government in Hong Kong. I think those countries, the United States or Great Britain, should not pretend to be ignorant of all these illegal things that Jimmy Lai have been doing, because let me tell you, if anyone in the United States or anyone in Great Britain did what Jimmy Lai did for Hong Kong, those people in the United States or in Britain would be arrested, and they would go through their due process and most likely be found guilty of these subversions and violence. They may be accused of treason, for example, and inciting violence and chaos and anarchy, and they will be punished accordingly. Because trained as a lawyer in the United States, I know how the rule of law system in the United States operates, and I know how the British legal system operates. They will never tolerate any such subversive acts by anyone in the United States or anyone in the United Kingdom, or for the owners of the press. Just look at what President Trump did for BBC, for example, accusing BBC, asking for indemnity for up to about $10 billion US, for example. We do not want to talk about the merits of that particular case. But the point is a simple one. Press freedom should never be allowed to exist in absolute terms. They always work and operate in an overall context of conditionalities, and those conditionalities should never be violated by the owners of the press agencies or the operators of the press agencies or anyone involved in these media activities.